at the University of Edinburgh Centre for Clinical Brain Sciences. I am here to speak to you about my research on sharing information and building rapport between autistic and non-autistic people, and how some of our empirical work relates to the double empathy problem. So normally I would start a talk by explaining a little bit about how autism can be defined and the double empathy problem, but because this is an event that is specifically about the double empathy problem in autism, I am going to skip over that and assume that we're kind of broadly on the same page, and I hope that this isn't an example of a double empathy problem here. But basically, the kind of shortened version is that based on the clinical definition of autism, so using the DSM wording, autism is defined by deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, deficits in social emotional reciprocity, in developing and maintaining relationships, and an absence of interest in peers. So because of all of this, we might expect that having a couple of autistic people interacting together, or a group of people who are all autistic, they might really struggle to communicate with one another. We might expect that their interaction will break down very quickly, because having two autistic people together who both struggle with social communication, struggle to understand other people, we might expect, given the clinical and diagnostic criteria, that interaction is going to break down very quickly. We might also expect that because non-autistic people have, quote, better social cognition, that they would be a better social partner for autistic people, because they are maybe more able to use their social skills to help scaffold that interaction and to understand their partner better. But that isn't what we hear from autistic people when we ask them about their interactions, and when we read about what autistic people have written and hear what they've said about this. We have many first-person accounts from autistic people saying that interacting with other autistic people is easier, more comfortable, and less stressful than interacting with non-autistic people. So for example, we hear from autistic people like Jim Sinclair saying that being autistic in a shared autistic space might be easier than being autistic in a non-autistic space. And the double empathy problem framework addresses this experience, so that interactions between autistic people might feel easier and more comfortable than interactions between autistic and non-autistic people. So according to the double empathy problem, difficulties in interactions between autistic and non-autistic people are not due to autistic cognition alone, but are related to a breakdown in reciprocity and mutual understanding that can happen with two people with very different ways of experiencing the world. So the double empathy problem suggests that when people with very different experiences of the world interact with one another, that they're going to struggle to empathise with each other. And so while the general narrative of the research literature has been that autistic people have difficulty empathising and interacting with others, the double empathy problem highlights that these miscommunications and difficult interactions are a bidirectional problem, and that non-autistic people can also find interacting with autistic people tricky and, you know, bring their own difficulties to the interaction. And so we wanted to look to see whether we could find any empirical evidence for interaction being easier and more successful when autistic people are with other autistic people compared to when autistic people are with non-autistic people. And it can be quite hard to look at communication and interaction in a really controlled way that allows you to compare across people in a systematic and scientific way, because communication and interaction has many different components to it. There's lots of variables, there's lots of moving parts. And so we designed a lab-based study that used something called a diffusion chain technique. And this diffusion chain technique allows us to look at how people share information in a very controlled and quantitative way. So diffusion chains have been used a lot in evolutionary psychology, as well as in studies with young children, to explore how culture and communication are shared within groups. And as far as we know, this is the first time that diffusion chains have been used with an adult autistic example, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how they work. So it's easiest to think of diffusion chains a little bit like the game telephone. So the way that they work is that you get a group of people to all come into a research session at the same time. So in our case, we had groups of 8 people come in at once, and you give everybody in that group of 8 a number between 1 and 8. So person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. The researcher then teaches the person who is number 1 a new skill, or they give them some new information. Person 1 then has to share this with person 2. Person 2 then shares this with person 3. Person 3 shares this with person 4, and so on. So it goes from 1 to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8. And we wanted to compare how information sharing within these diffusion chains differed if everybody in the chain was autistic, if everybody in the chain was non-autistic, and if we had chains that alternated between an autistic person and a non-autistic person. So this means that we had these groups of 8 adults, and some of the groups were non-autistic, some of the groups everyone was autistic, and some groups half of the participants were autistic and half were non-autistic, and we alternated between them in the chain. It's important to note at this point that everybody who participated didn't know the person who was next to them in the chain, the person who they were learning with. And in this study, we told people whether they were in a group of all autistic people, all non-autistic people, or whether they were in one of the alternating groups. So people were aware of whether they were talking to an autistic person or a non-autistic person. The task we used in the diffusion chains was looking at verbal information transfer. So we used basically a storytelling task. So we told the first participant in each diffusion chain a story. They then had to share that with the next person and so on, and it got shared through their group. So the story was about a bear, so that's why we have this picture of a bear here. And it was designed to have twists and turns that would be quite unpredictable. The story didn't have a social element to it at all. So in our story, the bear woke up, he was on a boat, he went on an adventure, and so it's all about the things that he encountered on his way. So it's quite a surreal story, and it had 30 separate components to it that we could basically score the task on out of 30 for each participant. So before I tell you the results, I'll go through a quick run through of some details about the participants who took part in the study. So we recruited 72 participants, 36 were autistic and 36 were non-autistic. We then allocated people to each of the conditions, so whether they were in a group with autistic people, with non-autistic people, or in a mixed group. And this allowed us to run 3 diffusion chains in each of the 3 conditions, so 9 chains in total. In each of these 3 conditions, participants were matched on age, gender, years of education, and IQ. So in the table here we have the means and standard deviations in the brackets. And as we would expect, our autistic participants obviously show significantly higher levels of autistic traits as measured by the AQ, but that's the only variable that they significantly differ on. So if we move on to the results and what we found, so this data is from the storytelling task, and what we're looking at here is how much information from that story about a bear is being shared at each point during the diffusion chain in the different groups. So if we look at this graph here, along the bottom we have numbers 1 to 8. So that's the participant order, the participant number. So whether they were the first person in the diffusion chain, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8. And then up the y-axis we have the number of story details that they remembered. So as you recall, the story was out of 30, and so that's the number of story details that they shared with the next person in the chain. The blue line on the graph is the non-autistic mean, the green line on the graph is the autistic mean, and the yellow line is the alternating, the mixed group mean. So what we can see from this graph is that when you have groups of all autistic people, they look like they share around about the same information, the same amount of information, in this task as the groups of non-autistic people. So the blue and green lines are kind of overlapping and intertwined throughout the kind of task, so that it looks like these two groups are performing fairly similarly. However, when we have groups that alternate between autistic and non-autistic people, that's when we have the scores that are shown on this yellow line. So you can see that they're starting off, even participant 1 is sharing less information and then goes on to share even less information at each participant down that diffusion chain. So that's when we seem to have this difficulty in social interaction and information not being shared when we have this mismatch between autistic and non-autistic people. So if we go and look at the numbers to look at how we analyse this statistically, we used a regression to look at the effect of the type of diffusion chain, so whether it was autistic, non-autistic or mixed, as well as the order that a person was in the chain, so that's whether they were number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8. And what we found here is that compared to being in the baseline group, which is the non-autistic group, there's no effect of being in the autistic group. And so what that means in very basic terms is that the autistic and the non-autistic group aren't significantly differing in how much information they share. So their lines are kind of, overlapping in the graph. That's, coming out again in the statistics. It looks like they're not significantly differing in how much information they share. However, there is a significant effect of group when we compare the neurotypical as the baseline to the mixed group. So again, what that means in very basic terms is that the mixed group is sharing a lot less information than the non-autistic and autistic groups. We also found a significant interaction for the mixed chain and the position that the person was in a chain. And what that means is that the rate that information is being lost at is significantly quicker when we have groups that alternate between autistic and non-autistic people. And so the kind of take-home messages, I guess, from this study is that autistic people are just as able to share information with other autistic people as non-autistic people are when they're with non-autistic people. The two groups do not significantly differ at all, and so autistic people are just as able to share this information as non-autistic people are. There are specific and selective difficulties with information transfer when we have this mixed group, so when autistic and non-autistic people are together. So this aligns with the double empathy theory, that when people of the same neurotype interact with one another, it's more successful than when people of different neurotypes interact with one another. So there's a paper for this study. It was published in Autism. If you'd like to read it, here is the reference. And very excitingly, we are about to start a large-scale replication of this study, which we are really, really looking forward to. So we're going to recruit a much larger sample, a much more diverse sample, and run the same study again and see what we find. So we're very, very much looking forward to that. So the next thing that I want to talk to you about is experiences of rapport between autistic and non-autistic people. So as I mentioned before, autistic people have spoken about how they can find interacting with other autistic people more comfortable than interacting with non-autistic people. And we wanted to examine whether we could study this in a scientific way, so to find out whether there are differences in how autistic people feel when they're with another autistic person compared to when they're with a non-autistic person, and also whether there are differences in how non-autistic people feel when they're interacting with a non-autistic person compared with an autistic person. And so we decided to examine this within the interactions of our diffusion chain study. And so the way that we did this is that after each of the interactions in the diffusion chain, we asked participants to rate how they'd felt and how they thought the interaction with the other person had gone. So we used a 100-point scale. So it looks very much like this slide here. So we had a line that went from 0 to 100 and a question above it. We asked people to pop an X on the line indicating how they felt about each of 5 areas. So we asked participants, how much did you enjoy interacting with this person? How easy did you find it? How successful was the interaction? How friendly was the interaction? and how awkward was the interaction. And awkward was obviously reverse scored. And these 5 domains had a high Cronbach's alpha, so it was over 0.7. And so in the subsequent analysis, we added them up to become a single scale of interactional rapport. And what we found is that when non-autistic people are with non-autistic people, they have high rapport. So that's this group on the left here. So that's the non-autistic group. So when non-autistic people are with non-autistic people, they have quite high rapport. When autistic people are with autistic people, that's this middle group here. So when autistic people's experience of rapport with other autistic people is lower significantly than non-autistic people, but it is higher than for the mixed pairs. So that's the group on the right here. And their rapport is significantly lower than both autistic pairs and the non-autistic pairs within those diffusion chains. So mixed groups of autistic and non-autistic people, mixed dyads, their rapport is significantly poorer. And so we wanted to dig a little bit deeper to find out whether that's because autistic people within those mixed dyads are having low rapport with non-autistic people, whether the non-autistic people are experiencing low rapport with autistic people, or whether it's both. So we split apart the mixed group so that we could kind of tease the results apart a little bit more. So what we can see in this graph is on the far left, we have the rapport for non-autistic people with other non-autistic people. So the group on the left here, that's non-autistic pairs. Next to that, we have non-autistic people with autistic people. So that's when a non-autistic person is rating their interaction with an autistic person. The third one along is when we have autistic people with other autistic people, so autistic pairs. And the last very funny shaped one is where we have autistic people with non-autistic people. So we did a two-way ANOVA on this data to examine the effect of neurotype, so whether someone is autistic or not autistic, and social context, so whether you are with someone who is of the same neurotype group as you or not. And we found a significant main effect of neurotype, so generally there were lower rapport scores in the autistic group, and a significant effect of social context, so there were generally lower ratings in the mixed group compared to the single neurotype group, but there was no significant interaction between neurotype and social context. So what this lack of an interaction indicates is that the lower rapport that's experienced within the mixed pairs isn't driven by participants of a particular neurotype. So both autistic and non-autistic participants in those mixed pairs, they're both experiencing low rapport, lower than they are in the single neurotype pairs. However, because when we kind of split the groups up like this, there is a lower number of participants in each group, there might be some issues with statistical power here that's kind of contributing to a lack of a significant effect. So again, we're going to be doing a replication, so hopefully we'll be able to address this more thoroughly over the next couple of years. We also asked observers to watch the videos of autistic, non-autistic and mixed pairs and to rate their rapport. So we used the same rapport for observers as we did with the self-rated rapport. So we asked them to rate each of the pairs on those 5 domains of enjoyment, ease, success, friendliness and awkwardness. And a couple of things to note. So firstly, our observers didn't know whether they were watching autistic, non-autistic or mixed pairs. They weren't told the diagnosis of the people in the videos, so they didn't know this. And the other thing to note is that we had autistic and non-autistic observers watching these videos. And so this is what we found. So the darker lines are for autistic observers and the lighter lines are for non-autistic observers. And then across the bottom we have the non-autistic pairs, the autistic pairs and the mixed pairs. And so what we found is that the mixed pairs, so this group on the right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, they were given poorer rapport scores by both autistic observers and non-autistic observers. And this suggests that a mismatch between the neurotypes results in lower ratings of rapport, and that, perhaps there are subtle verbal and non-verbal cues to rapport that are similarly kind of perceptible by autistic and non-autistic people. Interestingly, rapport scores were significantly higher for the autistic pairs, that's this middle group here, than the non-autistic pairs, which is this group on the left here. And that indicates that the autistic dyads might display even greater social signals of shared enjoyment and ease when interacting with one another that these external observers can pick up on. So if you would like to read more about how we did this self and observer ratings of rapport study, you can find it here. And I want to just finish up very quickly by talking about a study that was led by a student of mine, Olivia Riffai, which looked at markers of rapport in these autistic, non-autistic and mixed interactions. So we know that in non-autistic interactions, rapport is built and enhanced through verbal and non-verbal behaviours. So things like tone of voice, facial expression, eye contact, etc. They're all kind of very important in building rapport in the kind of non-autistic literature. So in this study, Olivia used video coding to see how often participants use two different social behaviours that are linked to rapport during these interactions. So she looked at mutual gaze, so when participants were both looking at each other at the same time, and back channeling. And back channeling is the little kind of verbal and non-verbal things that people do to kind of indicate that they are listening in a conversation, or indicate that, they're there, they're hearing you, they understand. So that might be things like kind of nodding or kind of tilting your head for non-verbal back channeling, or verbal back channeling might be things like saying, yeah, these kind of generally encouraging noises that people make. And Olivia coded these behaviours to see how frequently the autistic, non-autistic and mixed pairs had engaged in them during these interactions. She then looked to see whether these behaviours, the kind of frequency of these behaviours, related to the self-rated rapport score that the participants themselves had provided. And so what Olivia found is that the non-autistic pairs have relatively high levels of mutual gaze and back channeling, and that they also experience high levels of self-rated rapport. So that's not that surprising when you have a pair of non-autistic people. Good mutual gaze, good back channeling is related to high rapport. So that's what we would expect given the literature. The mixed pairs, so we have an autistic and a non-autistic person, they have relatively low mutual gaze and back channeling, and they also have low rapport. So again, so far this tracks with what we'd expect given what we know about rapport and behaviour. So things like mutual gaze and back channeling are associated with rapport. The more there is of them, the higher the rapport. However, in the autistic pairs, there was less back channeling and mutual gaze, but the autistic pairs still had higher self-rated rapport. So this suggests that autistic people don't depend on these social behaviours to build rapport with other autistic people. So this suggests that kind of visible markers of rapport might vary by neurotype or pairing, and give clues to inform how we might explore autistic interaction in the future. And we're really keen to do more work in this area, looking at building rapport between single neurotype or neurodiverse pairs. So if you would like to read more about investigating the markers of rapport between autistic and non-autistic interactions, you can find Olivia's paper in Autism in Adulthood. So thank you so much for listening.